morning, brother.
Good morning. Getting all wired up.
I am. How are you today, sister?
I'm good, thank you.
Good to
You?
see you both.
Your hands are warm.
Well, they were cold when I got here. Good morning, everybody. Hey, in case you're not aware, there's some good breakfast back there. It got here, and it is hot, and it is good, and Richard Connerup is going to eat it all if you don't go back there and get some. He's already told me he came here more for breakfast than the Sunday school lesson. Okay, I may have embellished a little bit, but hey, it's great to see you all. Glad you're here. We're going to have a good time in our Bible study today, but I do want to share with you just a couple things. First of all, I know that most of you, or many of you, are doing the Read Through the Bible with us in 2023, so there's a print copy up here if you'd like to follow a printed copy of the Discipleship Journal reading plan, or you can do like so many of us do with the electronic options. But it's a great thing, and I completed mine last year a couple weeks early and have already started on this year's January readings. Very, very good. We'll just be into a normal flow of things this week. Well, I say that. Things will be open even tomorrow here around the church, so if you have any needs, the office will be open on a regular schedule, so make sure you're aware of that, okay? Just glad to see you all, and so let's go ahead and jump into our Bible study today in John's Gospel, chapter 5. Had a great Bible study last week. Glad you were here to participate in that. But John chapter 5. Of course, you know that there are 4 Gospels, but there's a part of my Gospel of John is when I get to that part, this is how I'll read it. The story of Lazarus. I don't know why that would be one that had common use, but when we talk about the Gospels, of course there are similarities in all of the Gospels, but John's Gospel, more than any other of the Gospels, teaches has a specific purpose. John includes more miracles that are not in some of the other Gospels. There are just some of the things that John focuses on under Holy Spirit inspiration. What was the purpose John wrote his Gospel? Say again? What was John trying to prove about Jesus in his Gospel? Yeah, John specifically focuses in on that Jesus was God. And he tries to prove that all the way through. That's why he includes some of the miracles that are not recorded in the other 3 Gospels. We do talk about the other 3 Gospels. What do we call those collectively? Anybody know what the 3 first Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke? Yeah, the synoptic Gospels. Because even though there's different vantage points from the writers of those Gospels, the first 3 Gospels have a lot of the similar stories. There are some things that are in all 4 of the Gospels. But the story we're considering today is one of those stories that's only in John's Gospel. But again, I want you to keep in mind as we're developing some thoughts through this particular Gospel that John's purpose for writing and telling us these insights about Jesus is to prove that Jesus is God. All right? Jesus is deity. And part of that comes through loud and clear in this story that we're going to consider from John chapter 5. And we're going to start in verse 5 in just a moment. Let me ask you this question. You know, sometimes we see somebody and maybe you've heard it said, or maybe you have felt this feeling that we have pity for someone, all right? And then there's the other side of what God wants us to have, and that's compassion for somebody. What's the difference between pity and compassion? Can you give me a little bit of insight on the two different emotions? Anybody? A difference between pity and compassion. Yes, Tara, try. Okay. Okay. Yes. Tara said, pity often arises when we see someone and we see their situation. I know that we can look at a person perhaps and say, oh, that's pitiful, what's happened. But a lot of times, pity is born out of a person's circumstance, where compassion is usually born out of and directed towards somebody out of a genuine heart motive that's not based on pity at all right? But the person we're going to read about in this story finds himself in a pitiful situation, and yet that brings into Jesus' heart a compassion to help him. And so let's examine this story in John chapter 5, starting in verse 5. And this is going to be revealing the authority of Jesus. We're going to see that he has ultimate authority in 3 different domains within this story. And so let's just kind of consider that as we develop our thoughts, starting in verse 5. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. And when Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been there now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. Okay, we'll stop there for a moment and probe the significance of some of these things. Some of the stories we read in Jesus' healings are based upon the fact that these people, and it's specified in the scriptures, that they had had these infirmities for a long time, right? Can you think of any other Bible examples where it tells us that somebody had suffered for a long time? Okay, good. The woman with the issue of blood specifically tells us for 12 years, right? And she just kept getting worse and worse, and nobody even, she had spent everything she had with physicians. And Darren and Laura, you guys understand that. All of the physicians you guys have had to visit. But it takes a long time, and yet she wasn't getting any better until Jesus came, right? Who else can you think of that had an infirmity for a long time? What? Okay, that's one we're going to be examining today. Now, there are other crippled people that Jesus healed. The one where his friends brought him, remember, to Jesus, and he'd been lame for a long time. Anybody else remember another example? Yes, good. That's one I was thinking of, John chapter 9, where the man had been blind from birth. So he had never seen. This man, though, it tells us, for 38 years he has been lame. Now, what the story is takes place at a place called the Pool of Bethesda. Some of you are familiar with Bethesda National Hospital in Washington, D.C. Bethesda means healing, and that's why that hospital was named that. But in any event, this particular pool was near the sheep gate. It was a very familiar pool, reservoir, where water was. People would often come into the city. They could go to the Pool of Bethesda. There were areas where they could wash and get cleaned up a little bit before they went toward the temple. It's not far from the temple at all. Any reason, anybody want to guess why it was called the sheep gate? Apparently they brought a lot of sheep in that way. But again, because of its close proximity to the temple, these would have been sheep that often would have ended up in sacrifice to God for people who come that didn't have an animal to sacrifice. They would purchase that animal. We talked about that before. Okay, so here's this man. Now there was an interesting phenomenon, and really we almost everything that I believe about this is that it was just almost into the realm of superstition. There's no historical evidence. There's nothing in the Bible that says when this pool was stirred that people actually got healed. And the best way to explain this, because this is an aquifer, it's a water source for Israel, but it was built on a spring. And so apparently the movement in this pool was just this artesian well that would occasionally bubble up, and they would see that as, oh, there's something supernatural going on with the water, and people would try to get into the water and get their infirmity healed. Okay? So there's really, in my opinion, nothing that would really put any supernatural benefit to this. They just believed that. And that's what this man believes. Okay, now he's been lame for 38 years. He's lying there by this pool, waiting, hoping that he can respond when the water is stirred or troubled. What are a couple presuppositions we have? I mean, first of all, the man's situation is pitiful, right? What do you think he's doing when he's there? Because apparently he's there frequently, hoping that he can get into the water if it is troubled by an angel. Okay. There's no question in my mind that he must be relying on begging. I mean, now, maybe there's some people in his life that are helping him. Why would we come to that conclusion? He has to get there. And yet in the story, he's going to tell Jesus, there's no man that helps me, so I never can get in first. But the implication is somebody brings him there. I mean, possibly he just, through his crippled limbs, gets there and forces himself there. But it's likely that some people have helped him. But apparently the only way he's going to survive through the day is to beg for the help of other people that are coming to this same area for whatever reason. So notice what it says, though, in verse 6, that when Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, Jesus asked him, would you like to be made whole? Right? What does that one verse imply or implicate about Jesus? Okay, first of all, he sees the person's pitiful situation and he's has compassion for him. Good. What else is in that verse? Yes. Okay, good. April, yes. That Jesus knows what he's about to do and that he is capable of healing this man. Did you notice, though, that it said that when he saw this man that was lying there, it says that Jesus knew that he had been in this case a long time. This is part of that divinity side of Jesus that John points out regularly in these stories. I mean, a normal, regular person walking there and seeing a lame man laying there would not necessarily be able to conclude, oh, this guy, he's been lame a long time. But Jesus knew his circumstance and also knew, out of his compassion, what he was about to do. All right? So John tells us how long he's been there and that Jesus knew he had been there a long time. And Jesus asks him very pointedly, would you like to be made whole? Yes, Mike. Mike asked, is that question just a physical question? At this point, I think it's just the physical. Because even in the man's reaction to the healing, there is an ongoing him trying to grasp who this person is that has done this. Because that's the indication. I mean, as we read forward, this guy has no idea who Jesus is, which is kind of interesting in itself. Now, we're in the early ministry of Jesus in his public ministry, but he's already been healing people, and up in Galilee at least, his fame is going everywhere. But we don't know for what reason, what feast that Jesus has come to Jerusalem for, but he comes to the pool of Bethesda, sees this man. By the way, the pool of Bethesda, it's a place we frequently visit when we're in Israel. I was there just last month, and it's very deep excavation. But the pool apparently had several levels where the water would cascade down into another pool, and again, a very common place. And again, with the thought of this tradition or superstition, that if somebody could get in the water when it bubbles, that's an angel stirring it up, and maybe there's some medicinal or healthful benefits to it. And that's what Jesus asks him. Would you like to be made whole? Jesus knows his circumstance, and it's not out of pity that Jesus is asking. He's asking out of compassion. And so the man answers, and it's a pitiful answer. Even the comment there in verse 7, the impotent man answered, Sir, I have no man. When the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming to the water, and another person steps down before me. Happens every time. Now, there, again, he doesn't say, and nothing in the story says that these people that get into the water before him enjoy any healing benefit. But he believes that if he can get there, he might be benefited. And so, but he's impotent. You know, even that term indicates his lack of capability. And even if friends had brought him there on a daily basis, no one's with him. He's by himself. There's nobody to help him get to the water if there's a chance that he can get healed from that. And so it just says very pointedly in verse 8, Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. All right? And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. All right, what do you see in that? Even from a medical side of things, I mean, the immediacy of Jesus' reaction out of compassion is to heal him. And it says that. And immediately he was healed. what is implied in that healing? What? Okay, sure. We're talking about Jesus' authority over sickness, right? It doesn't have anything to do with that. Any other? Yes, Karen, thought? Okay. How long's he been lame? 38 years. Any of you who have ever dealt with someone in infirmity, Pamela, were you going to say something like that? I thought your hand was going up like you were going to answer something. Oh, that I know how that works. Pamela tells Randy all the answers, and then Randy answers, right? But yeah, I want to point out though what Karen said is, muscles atrophy, right? The longer someone lies in a bed, the more their muscles atrophy. They lose strength. We don't know if this is from birth. It doesn't say that. It just says he's been lame for 38 years. But the truth of the matter is, there is no musculature structure here that has been developed enough for this man to walk. I mean, we've all seen examples of people who just get injured and have to go through rehabilitation. Somebody who's involved in an accident has to learn how to walk. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. With a stroke or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that it can be a hard and arduous process of rehab just to be able to walk again. So what Jesus does here, and by the way, I'll point it out, anytime Jesus does a miracle, it's immediate. There's the one example, and it really was to test the person's faith. When you remember, Jesus put some mud on a blind man's eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. All right? So that particular miracle had a little bit of a process to test his faith on whether he would follow through. But almost every other miracle we see Jesus doing, there's an instantaneous, miraculous healing. And that's the case here. This man who had not walked for 38 years suddenly stands up when Jesus tells him to do it, and he is walking. And first of all, let me just make a couple other observations. There were other people at this pool. But Jesus apparently has an appointment with this one person. And it's not that Jesus loves him any more than he loves anybody else. He just knew this man's circumstance, asked him, do you want to be healed? And the man had enough faith to say, yes, but I don't have anybody to help me. And so, moved by compassion, Jesus says, all right, stand up and pick up your mat, your bed, and walk. Well, again, the implications of that immediate healing is there, but this man, no doubt, was amazed at what had happened. But one of the interesting parts of this story is he doesn't say thank you. Now, not that it's recorded in the scripture. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about not only does Jesus have authority over illness, but he also has authority over the Sabbath, because that's what's going to come out of this. And Jesus knew it was the Sabbath. Let's go ahead and read the next few verses. Verse 10. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, it is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. All right? Now, whether or not they know this guy's the guy that's been at the pool of Bethesda and he hasn't walked for 38 years and he's walking around or not, we don't know. And when John usually says the Jews asked him, it's almost always in relationship to Jewish religious leaders. I mean, it says, at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, that the Jews cried out, "Crucify him." It's not necessarily all the Jewish people. It's almost always pointing to the religious leaders. And that's what's going on here. They're the ones that are offended at this whole thing. But they say to him, is it lawful? It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed, at the end of verse 10. Verse 11, he answered them, he that made me whole, the same said unto me, take up thy bed and walk. Then asked they him, well, what man is that which said unto thee, take up thy bed and walk? And he said that was healed, wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away, and a multitude being in that place. In other words, what that verse is saying was, Jesus didn't reveal himself. The guy didn't have any idea what his name was. And Jesus left after this event happened. He conveyed himself away. He walked away and melded into the crowd. And all of a sudden, this guy has no answers to those questions. But the religious people are all upset about this. Not the fact that the guy was cured, not the fact that he was now walking, and it's hard to imagine he wasn't walking with a big smile on his face, but he's carrying around this mat, and he's being criticized for breaking the Sabbath law. Say what? Yeah, oh yeah, good point. Where's their compassion? That's exactly the point that's being driven home here. Is now, what were they basing this violation on? What was it that they thought he was guilty of violating the Sabbath? He's working. He's working. Now, God in the Old Testament, when God gave the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, along with the other laws, that's one of the main 10 first laws, right? Was thou shalt remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And there's instruction with that, but a rule like this was not given by God. What has happened over the centuries and centuries of time are the Jewish leaders would add things that were work. And they would tell people, you can only do so much on the Sabbath. You can't, you're not supposed to cook. You're supposed to do enough food that you don't have to cook. Just give it out. So they had added to God's intentional intent of the Sabbath to make it a day of rest and a day of celebration for God and a day of glorifying and praising the Lord and honoring Him. They had perverted that and added a whole bunch of these things that are now related to working on the Sabbath. And they've got this whole list of things, traditions of the fathers, that most people didn't even know. Now, this guy probably understood it would be interpreted him carrying around his bed, his mat, that he was working. And that's certainly what they jumped on his case about, right? I've told you before about our multiple visits to Israel. And on Friday evening, as the sun sets, it's the beginning of Shabbat, the Sabbath, right? And it goes all through the night, and then all day during the day on Saturday, and then at evening on Saturday, it's over. But that's Sabbath. And we frequently stay in hotels where on Sabbath they have a Shabbat elevator. The Shabbat elevator comes down into the lobby, opens up, people get on the elevator, it closes automatically, goes up to the first floor and opens. People who want to get off on the first floor get off, closes, goes up the second floor, opens. But what's unique about it, Scott? It stops on every floor, going up and down, because you're not supposed to push a button. That's work on the Sabbath. Are you going to convert to Judaism for that reason? I can stay in bed and not get dressed and just sleep all day on the Sabbath. Well, that's resting. So, yeah, keep an eye on her. We don't want her to convert to Judaism for that reason. What? You're the Shabbat servant? Yeah, no, nobody's going to buy that. All right, but what this man is chided for, first of all, they have no compassion. They don't celebrate the fact that he has been healed after 38 years of being lame. They want to know why he's carrying around his bed. And the guy goes, well, the guy that healed me, he told me to pick it up and carry it. Well, where's he? What's his name? I don't know. Didn't introduce himself. But part of the implication of that is, I mean, maybe it happened, it's just not recorded, that the guy was thankful to Jesus for what happened, but there's almost this sense of he does what he's told to do, but doesn't spend a lot of time thanking Jesus for this miraculous healing. And as soon as he's provoked or confronted about walking around breaking the Sabbath, he's quick to blame Jesus for that, even though he doesn't know who it is. And yet that's who the religious leaders are upset about. Okay, so verse 13 says that Jesus just left the crowd. The guy doesn't know who he is. Can't give him credit, but he can't blame him either. But notice verse 14. Verse 14, afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple and saith unto him, behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon thee. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. Okay. Let me go ahead and read a couple more verses in the context of this. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on a Sabbath day. But Jesus answered them, my Father worketh hitherto, and I work. Therefore when the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he'd not only broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making him equal with God, they're really upset about that. Okay, so let's stop there. All right, so not only does Jesus have authority over the illness, authority over the Sabbath, he has authority over these people. And it's in this declaration that he is from God, and in fact, more than that, he is God. And so, what do you see in verse 14 that Jesus discovers this guy? He's up at the temple when they're reintroduced. Any insights on that? Okay. Jesus knows what he did. He knows he's whole, but what are the implications of that verse? Go. Okay, good. Before that, what does it say? What were you going to say? Okay, good, Jenny, yeah. Even before that, what's it say? Not yet. Jesus found him. Jesus went looking for him. I mean, that's the implication. Again, verse 14, afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple and saith unto him. And so I see that there's an implication that Jesus is looking for him now in a subsequent circumstance. And as you pointed out, he's in the temple, which does imply that perhaps he's gone there in celebration of the fact that he's now been made whole. There's a provision in the book of Leviticus when someone has something miraculous happen to them, something special happen to them, that people would give a thanksgiving offering to God for no other reason except that they were thankful, right? So maybe he's gone there to fulfill some law, maybe to make a sacrifice, but in any event, Jesus goes to the temple and finds him. The possibility is that he's at the temple because of what has taken place in his healing. But Jesus talks to him then in verse 14, and he does chide him. Now, I don't want it to imply, even in Jesus' statement, when Jesus said, now go and sin no more, there's no reason to believe that this 38 years of this man's lameness was necessarily tied to a particular sinning circumstance. What Jesus is saying is, you need to rejoice in what happened to you, and you also need to know that sin is still always prevalent. I mean, this is similar to the woman caught in adultery, right? Jesus said that neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. The idea is you need to be aware that sin is ever present. And if you sin, it could result in a consequence of something happening. Could be judged for that. So one of the things, this, Mike, is where Jesus is dealing more at the spiritual level. He heals the man physically. The guy takes up his bed, heads off over to the temple after being confronted by the religious leaders. He probably had to put his mat down somewhere, wait till Sabbath was over so he could go pick it up. But in any event, he ends up at the temple. So this is a individual religious part of the story, and Jesus is now dealing with him on a personal sin level, that he recognized he's a sinner and that God had been gracious to him in this healing. But it's at that point that the man leaves. But what does the man find out about the person who healed him? Yeah, at some point, now it doesn't tell us that he's introduced, and Jesus introduces himself. It just says, by the time they're done conversing, this guy has discovered, his name is Jesus. Because when he leaves and he sees some of these religious people in the next verse, it says that the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. Now again, that's not necessarily an implication that this guy's trying to give Jesus up in this. I mean, he's acknowledging, this is the man who made me whole. He could have said, this is the guy who told me to carry my bed, to break the Sabbath. But at some point in this interaction, the guy finds out this is Jesus. And when he sees these religious leaders, he tells them it's Jesus. So the man departed, verse 15, we read that, verse 16, and therefore the Jews. Now again, I mentioned it at the beginning, but this is near the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry. This is one of the first times he's down in Jerusalem. This is not near the time of the crucifixion. We'll get there soon enough, but this is just one of the visits Jesus had to Jerusalem. But what I want to point out is they start determining that Jesus is first of all, they determine Jesus is a threat to them. I mean, John 3, we already looked at that when Nicodemus said, we know that only someone who's from God can do what you do. So there's already this tension building and this idea that some people recognize that only someone who's from God could do the miraculous things that Jesus is doing. Even some of the religious leaders like Nicodemus. But this is becoming more and more and more of a threat to these people because they're afraid they're going to lose all of their power and authority. Before long, in the Gospel of John, we're going to read Caiaphas say, you know what? It's expedient that one should die rather than we lose the whole nation. If we don't do something about Jesus, everybody's going to follow him. Okay? And so that's part of what's going on. But I'm pointing out that from the very beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, there are those who are going to try to take him out. They start persecuting him. And they sought to slay him because he had not done these things, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. So their ultimate interpretation is he's a lawbreaker because he violated the work on the Sabbath principle. Jesus is going to directly confront them about the Sabbath in other places. And we'll get to those as we have opportunity. But he is going to remember, you'll remember he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And why do you follow all of the traditions of your fathers, and yet you disobey the weightier matters of the law? Remember how Jesus confronted them for their hypocrisy. We started from the beginning talking the difference between pity, and we pity somebody's circumstance perhaps, and yet compassion that is directed towards the individual. Jesus had compassion. These people had no compassion. They were driven by their legalistic tendencies, and all they could see, they were blinded with rage because of this very popular and growing more popular rabbi was being, in their opinion, guilty of violating these sabbatical laws, and therefore he was worthy of death. And so that's what's going on in these latter parts. But I want you to see it very clearly that Jesus is pointing out in verses 17 and 18 his deity status. Now, we already saw it at the beginning of the story. Jesus, without any prior knowledge, nobody told him about the lame man's circumstance, but Jesus knew he'd been in this condition a long time. 38 years, as it turns out. But in verses 17 and 18, even though they want to start a plot to kill him for being a Sabbath lawbreaker, Jesus answered them, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." You know what he's really saying there is? To these religious leaders who are so punctilious about observing the Sabbath laws. Jesus says, you know what? God works all the time on the Sabbath. We understand that, right? God doesn't, when it says that on the seventh day God rested, it wasn't because God was exhausted in creation. It wasn't that he needed to take a break. He was establishing a pattern that humans should follow to prioritize a day for worship and you know, meditation and reading, those kinds of things. But you know what it really needs to be reminded is that God works all the time. You know, we're talking about whether a person is healed by a miracle or by medicine. You know, God is still at work taking care of people and their needs. God doesn't take time off. I mean, remember Elijah mocked the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth on Mount Carmel. Maybe your God's asleep. Maybe he's on a vacation. You need to cry a little louder. Hey, the Bible is clear. God works all the time, and he knows everything that's going on, and God answers prayers. God works on the Sabbath. And Jesus said, I'm here doing what God sent me to do. And then so pointedly in verse 18, which even infuriated them more, therefore the Jews sought to kill him, because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father. Notice the last part of that verse, making him equal with God. See, John's showing us all the way through his gospel that God sent Jesus, but that Jesus is himself God in human form. And this is what we need to understand was exactly the way the Jews interpreted the idea that Jesus said, God is my Father. That meant to them he was declaring equal status with God. Well, when we get further into the Gospel of John 17, when he talks about I and my Father are one, Jesus is making it very clear that he's deity. But he has to be, because only God can die and pay for the sins of the whole world. So Jesus has to be God. Really early on, these people realized what he was saying. When he said, God is my Father, they understood that to mean that he was declaring equalness with God. He was God. All right. So even though they're offended, Jesus is establishing, even in this miracle, that he has omniscient understanding. He knew this man had been in this condition a long time. Jesus had compassion on him, healed him. But part of this healing was to reveal that he also had authority over the Sabbath and authority over sin and the consequences of sin. And that is why he has come. Okay? So as we just transition to our week, just remember some of the principles of this. That God has authority in our life, and it's every day. God is working, and we should be too, as far as in our service to him. We should be a little bit more obviously thankful than this guy was that was healed. I mean, the story itself, we have so many other examples where people were very thankful when Jesus did the miraculous in their case. Got some others like the lepers, the 10 lepers, remember, that were healed, and only one came back and told Jesus, thank you. But we should be thankful people. And when we see God working in our life, even if we don't see something specifically answered as prayer, we still should give him praise and thank him for all of his great grace and love and compassion for us. All right, time's up. We'll stop there. Thank you for being here. It's great to see you all. My heart's encouraged. And Jess and April, God bless you.